The cities that simply emptied out. Imagine a city of 100,000 people, temples 60 meters tall, palaces, wide paved roads, an intricate system of reservoirs, astronomical observatories, and a writing system precise enough to record dates down to the exact day, thousands of years forward and backward. Now, imagine that over the span of 1 or 2 generations, that city simply empties out. It isn't destroyed in a siege, it doesn't burn to the ground. People just leave, abandoning homes, temples, and entire libraries of carved stone monuments standing empty. And over the following 1,000 years, the jungle completely swallows what had been one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is what happened to the classic Maya civilization between the 8th and 10th centuries C. And despite decades of research, we still don't have a single, final answer to the question, why? Not a conquest, and not one single catastrophe. The first thing worth clearing up, the Maya never disappeared as a people. That's one of the most stubborn myths lodged in popular culture, the idea that Maya civilization mysteriously vanished into thin air. In reality, descendants of the Maya live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras today, speak languages from the Mayan language family, and some traditions tracing back to the classic period survive in their culture even now. It wasn't the people who disappeared. What disappeared was a particular model of civilization, enormous city-states with monumental architecture, royal dynasties immortalizing themselves on carved stone stelae, and a complex hierarchical system binding together hundreds of thousands of people. And this didn't happen all at once or across the entire Maya territory simultaneously. It was a drawn-out, uneven process archaeologists call the classic collapse, one that primarily affected the southern lowlands, in what is now northern Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, while some northern cities, like Chichen Itza, continued to thrive for several more centuries after their southern neighbors had already emptied out. It is also worth noting, this wasn't the first or only catastrophe in Maya history. Long before the classic collapse, there was a lesser-known but no less significant decline in the so-called pre-classic period, in the early centuries C, when earlier major cities like El Mirador fell. Maya civilization, in fact, went through several cycles of dramatic growth and sharp contraction throughout its history, which on its own hints that the causes should be sought not in a single sudden event, but in systemic, recurring vulnerabilities. Stone inscriptions that scream of panic. One of the most valuable sources of information about the collapse is the Maya writing system itself, carved into dozens of stelae across the lowlands. The Maya were obsessive record keepers of dates, using an astonishingly precise long count calendar. And thanks to that, archaeologists can trace exactly how political activity in these cities slowed down and broke off, year by year. The picture that emerges from these inscriptions is unsettling. In cities undergoing collapse, references to warfare between neighboring Maya kingdoms spike sharply, not campaigns of conquest aimed at expanding territory, but, judging by the wording, far more desperate conflicts, the kind typical of a struggle over dwindling resources. The number of deliberately destroyed monuments rises too. Stelae were intentionally smashed, toppled from their pedestals, the names of kings chiseled out, which, in a culture that placed enormous symbolic weight on a ruler as public memory, amounted to a political assassination of a man already dead. And then, in some cities, the stone record simply stops. The last known date recorded using the old long count calendar falls near the end of the 9th century. After that, no one in the region raises another dated monument in the old tradition. That doesn't mean people died overnight. It means the entire system that required a ruling dynasty's existence to be immortalized in stone had collapsed, and along with it, the entire elite class that had sustained that tradition. The drought the tree rings never talked about for a long time. The leading suspect behind the collapse was thought to be warfare and internal political conflict on its own. But over the last 20 to 30 years, climate science has substantially reshaped the picture, adding a far more fundamental culprit. Researchers studying sediment cores from lake beds across the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as stalactites and stalagmites in the region's caves, have managed to reconstruct a fairly detailed climate record spanning the past several thousand years. And that record shows something striking. The period coinciding with the classic Maya collapse is marked by a series of prolonged, unusually intense droughts, far more severe than the normal seasonal fluctuations the civilization had long adapted to. The core problem for the Maya lay in the very architecture of their survival. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Maya had no large permanent rivers to fall back on during the dry season. The Yucatan lowlands are notoriously poor in surface water sources. Instead, major cities built enormous artificial reservoirs designed to capture seasonal rainfall and stretch it across the months of drought. This system was remarkably sophisticated from an engineering standpoint, but it was also entirely dependent on climate predictability. Once the rain cycle shifted for several years in a row, reservoirs designed to buffer a single bad season, not a decade of anomalies, simply couldn't keep up. By some climatologists' estimates, individual drought periods during this era may have cut average annual rainfall by 40%, or even as much as 70%, compared to normal levels, a catastrophic figure for any agricultural system entirely dependent on rain. A civilization that cut down its own future, but it would be an oversimplification to say the Maya were simply victims of climate whims. A growing body of archaeological and paleoecological research suggests the Maya themselves substantially contributed to their own vulnerability. Long before the droughts intensified, the classic period was a time of explosive population growth. The population of the lowlands grew, by various estimates, to several million people, a density comparable to, and in places exceeding, that of some regions of medieval Europe. To feed that many people, the Maya cleared forests for agricultural land on an industrial scale for their era. Pollen analysis from lake sediment shows a sharp, almost precipitous decline in forest cover in exactly the centuries leading up to the collapse. Mass deforestation, in turn, may have triggered a vicious cycle that deepened the drought further. Forests play a role in local moisture evaporation and cloud formation. Their large-scale disappearance can reduce regional rainfall on its own, independent of broader global climate trends. In other words, the Maya likely didn't just encounter a drought. They may have, at least partly, created the very conditions that made that drought far more devastating than it would have been in a less populated, less deforested landscape. Add to that the depletion of soils farmed for centuries without modern methods of fertility restoration, and you get a classic overpopulation trap. A system optimized for peak prosperity turns out to be catastrophically fragile at the exact moment conditions begin to change. Why they never rebuilt? A reasonable question. Why didn't the Maya simply rebuild their cities after the drought, the way many other civilizations have recovered from crises? The answer, it seems, is that the collapse struck not just infrastructure, but the very political legitimacy of royal authority itself. Maya ideology closely tied the figure of the king to the ability to maintain balance with the world of gods and natural forces, including rainfall. Rulers literally depicted themselves on monuments as intermediaries guaranteeing the land's fertility and timely rains through ritual and bloodletting sacrifice. When a prolonged drought, stretching across an entire generation's lifetime, repeatedly demonstrated that kings could not deliver the promised celestial order, it apparently undermined the very foundation on which centralized power rested. As a result, rather than rallying around a weakened elite to rebuild together, the population of many cities, based on archaeological migration data, simply dispersed, moving in smaller groups to areas less affected by the drought, where they could return to a less centralized, more flexible way of life in small rural communities. It wasn't a catastrophe that wiped out the Maya. Catastrophe made the old model of social organization unviable, and people rationally chose a more resilient alternative, even if a far less monumental one. One city, one king, one failed ritual. To feel the collapse not as an abstract statistic but as a real human drama, it is worth looking at the history of one specific city, Copán, in what is now Honduras. Here, archaeologists managed to reconstruct an almost complete royal lineage spanning for centuries of rule, an exceptionally rare case in pre-Columbian America, where history can be traced by name rather than through anonymous cultural layers alone. The 16th and last known ruler of Copán, who took the throne near the end of the 8th century, left behind a monument archaeologists nicknamed Altarque, a stone platform depicting all 16 kings of the dynasty arranged in a circle, each one passing a symbol of power to the next, closing a loop of succession for centuries long. It reads as a clear gesture of desperate legitimization. By that point, the city was already facing serious problems: depleted farmland in a narrow river valley, overpopulation, early signs of drought. The ruler seems to have been trying to remind both himself and his subjects of the unshakable nature of his authority by leaning on the weight of his ancestors. It didn't work. His successor left behind not a single major monument with a precise calendar date, an exceedingly rare break in a tradition that had lasted centuries. Excavations of the royal palace show that around this time it was hastily patched up using cheap materials, dramatically inferior in quality to the former royal residence, a telling archaeological sign that the crown no longer had the resources, or perhaps the willing subjects, to do otherwise. Within a few more decades, Copán's royal palace complex was completely abandoned, although some ordinary residents, based on the archaeological record, remained in the surrounding area for another century or more, gradually shifting to a far more modest, decentralized rural way of life. Copán's story, in miniature, mirrors what happened across the entire Maya lowlands. Not instant death, but a slow fading, stretched across generations, specifically of the royal, monumental model of power, while the people themselves kept on living on that land, simply no longer investing in the grand temples and dated stelae that had stopped inspiring confidence. The jungle as a time machine. Perhaps the most striking part of this entire story is how quickly the jungle reclaimed the abandoned cities. In the tropical climate of the lowlands, vegetation reconquers territory astonishingly fast. Within a few decades of a city's last residents leaving, stone temples were already being overtaken by fig tree roots and vines, and within a couple of centuries, entire pyramids had turned into forest-covered mounds, indistinguishable from natural terrain to an untrained eye. That's precisely why many of the largest Maya cities remained essentially invisible to the outside world for centuries after Europe's conquest of the continent. 16th century Spanish colonizers frequently passed within a few kilometers of gigantic pyramids completely hidden beneath forest cover, with no idea they even existed. Some major urban centers weren't rediscovered by science until the 20th century, and new sites are still being found today. In 2018, a large-scale lidar survey of the Guatemalan jungle revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown Maya structures at once, including entire cities hidden beneath the vegetation that no one had even suspected existed. A lesson that is hard to ignore. The story of the Maya collapse has drawn so much attention in recent years, not just because of its mystery, but because of its unnervingly familiar structure: overpopulation, environmental degradation caused by the civilization itself, climate stress layered on top of that fragility, and, ultimately, a crisis of confidence in a governing system unable to cope with a new reality. Many researchers draw direct parallels between this scenario and modern conversations about climate change and urban resilience. The Maya didn't vanish overnight, and they weren't wiped out by an outside enemy. Their civilization became a hostage to its own success, a system so finely tuned to a specific set of climate conditions that the moment those conditions shifted, the entire structure began to collapse on several levels at once: ecological, economic, and ideological. Tellingly, this lesson was never entirely lost on the Maya themselves. The northern cities of the Yucatan, including Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, fairly quickly developed more flexible forms of governance, less dependent on the charisma of a single divine king, something closer to a council of nobles than a cult built around one demigod ruler. These northern societies went on to thrive for several more centuries after the southern lowlands had largely emptied out, perhaps because they had absorbed a hard lesson: a system in which the well-being of millions of people depends on one man's supposed ability to magically summon rain is bound, sooner or later, to run into a drought no ritual can stop. And today, walking among the ruins of Tikal or Copán, looking at temples the jungle spent 1,000 years reclaiming, it is hard not to wonder just how solid the systems we currently take for granted really are.